Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Last week, a Forest Service worker found a report inside an abandoned cabin. It was written by someone who entered the cabin 3 hours earlier. But the handwriting looked 80 years old. The person? Never seen again. I spent months collecting these 7 cabin stories from Appalachia, and honestly, I'm scared to even read them out loud. People who went inside these places, they either vanished or came back wrong. Something lives in those woods, and it's been waiting a very, very long time. Before your heart starts racing, hit subscribe and drop a like. Share this if you dare. Tell me in the comments where you're from. Turn down the lights. What you're about to hear. Some people say these cabins are still out there, waiting for the next visitor. Let's go. I'm 34 now, and I still check my rearview mirror more than I should when driving these mountain roads. My name's Danny Rodriguez, and what happened to me 3 years ago in the hollers outside Beckley changed everything I thought I knew about the old ways that still run deep in these West Virginia mountains. I've been installing cable and internet for Appalachian cable services since I was 19. 15 years of crawling under houses, routing cable through 100-year-old walls, and dealing with customers who sometimes haven't seen another soul in months. But nothing in all that time prepared me for what I found up on Crow's Peak, in a cabin that shouldn't have existed, serving a man who'd been dead for 70 years. Growing up in these mountains, you hear stories. Every family's got them. Tales passed down about things that happened back in the hollers, about places where the rules don't quite work the same way they do everywhere else. My abuela used to tell me about los vigilantes, watchers who guard places of power, souls bound to protect something so important they can't move on even after death. I figured they were just stories, the kind every culture has to explain the things that don't make sense. Mountain people have always been practical folks, but they also know there are things in these old hills that defy explanation. I should have paid more attention to those stories. The work order came in on a Tuesday morning in October, right when the leaves were at their peak, and every ridge looked like it was on fire with color. Customer requesting emergency internet installation at 1247 Crow's Peak Road, a Frank Morrison, who claimed his cable had been out for too long and was willing to pay triple our emergency rate for same-day service. The address bothered me immediately. I'd been working these mountains for 15 years, and I knew most of the roads by heart. Crow's Peak Road only went about 3 miles up before it dead-ended at an old mining operation that had been abandoned since the 1950s. There were no houses past mile marker 2. I mentioned this to my supervisor, Rick Lawson, a third-generation cableman whose daddy and granddaddy had strung the first phone lines through these hills back when the coal companies owned everything. Rick frowned when I showed him the work order, scratching his graying beard like he always did when something didn't sit right. "That's mighty strange, Danny. I grew up hunting those ridges, and I ain't never seen no house at that address." He pulled up our service maps on his computer, and we both stared at the screen. According to our records, we'd been providing service to 1247 Crow's Peak Road since 1952, when the company was still Beckley Telephone and Telegraph. The account was in good standing, paid in advance through the year 2025. "Well, I'll be damned," Rick muttered. "System shows we got active service there, but I swear on my mama's grave that road don't go where this says it goes." The customer had been specific about timing, had to be completed before sunset, no exceptions. When Rick tried calling the number on the work order to confirm the appointment, he got a busy signal, the kind you don't hear much anymore in the age of digital phones. The old mechanical buzz that meant someone was actually on a landline somewhere, talking to somebody else. I loaded my van with extra equipment, including some of the older analog gear we keep on hand for customers who haven't upgraded their systems in decades. Something about this job felt like it might require the vintage stuff. As I drove up Crow's Peak Road, I passed the landmarks I knew by heart. The old Hennessy place where nobody had lived since the mine disaster of '98, the creek where my daddy used to take me fishing when I was small, the rusted-out coal tipple that marked the halfway point up the mountain. But as I kept driving, the road continued past where it should have ended. The asphalt was older here, cracked and patched with the kind of tar work they used to do back in the 50s. Massive oak trees pressed in from both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even in broad daylight, I had to turn on my headlights to see properly. My GPS lost signal completely, and the radio started picking up what sounded like old-time music, fiddle and banjo songs I'd never heard before, played in styles that sounded like they came from another era entirely. When I finally reached 1247 Crow's Peak Road, I sat in my van for a full minute, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The cabin was beautiful in the way old mountain homes can be when they've been properly maintained. Hand-hewn logs, darkened with age, a stone foundation that looked like it had been built by someone who understood how to work with the mountain rather than against it. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and I could see the warm glow of kerosene lamps through windows that still had the original wavy glass. But everything about the place felt wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. The trees around the cabin were the wrong species, massive chestnuts that had been wiped out by blight before I was born, growing alongside oaks that looked older than anything I'd ever seen in these mountains. The very air felt thicker here, like it was holding more than just humidity and mountain mist. Frank Morrison was waiting on the porch when I got out of my van, and I knew immediately that this wasn't going to be a routine service call. He was tall and lean in the way mountain men used to be, with the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of hard living outdoors. But his clothes were what made me stop in my tracks. Wool pants held up with suspenders, a flannel shirt that looked hand-sewn, and work boots that were old leather, not the modern composite stuff everyone wears now. "You'd be Danny," he said, walking down the porch steps with the easy stride of a man comfortable in his own space. "I appreciate you making the drive up here. Cable's been out for quite a spell, and I've been missing my program something fierce." His handshake was firm and calloused, the grip of someone who'd worked with his hands his entire life. But his skin was cold, unnaturally cold, like he'd been standing outside in winter instead of sitting by a warm fire on a mild October afternoon. "Mr. Morrison," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I have to say, I'm a little confused about the service history here. Our records show we've been providing cable to this address since 1952, but..." Frank's smile never wavered. "Been here my whole life, son. My daddy built this place in 1923, right after he came back from the war. We've always tried to keep up with the times, get the latest conveniences when we can afford them." I pulled out my tablet to show him the service records, but the screen was blank. Not dead, blank, like it was on but displaying nothing at all. I tried turning it off and on again, but nothing changed. Frank watched with what seemed like patient amusement. "Sometimes the old ways and the new ways don't play nice together," he said. "Come on inside, and I'll show you where the trouble is." The interior of the cabin was like stepping into a museum exhibit of Appalachian life from the 1950 seconds. Everything was period appropriate and perfectly maintained. A Philco radio on a side table, a coal-burning stove in the kitchen, furniture that looked like it had been handmade by someone with real skill. Family photographs covered the mantel above the fireplace. Black and white portraits of stern-faced mountain people in clothes that belonged to another era. What made my blood run cold was the television in the corner of the living room. It was a massive Zenith console TV from the early 1950 seconds. The kind with a tiny screen and a cabinet big enough to hold a small refrigerator. But it was showing current programming. A CNN news broadcast that I'd seen that morning before leaving for work. The picture was crystal clear, in full color, on a television that should have been capable of displaying nothing but fuzzy black and white images from the 3 networks that existed when it was built. "That's the trouble," Frank said, gesturing toward the TV. "Picture comes and goes. Sometimes it works fine for weeks, then suddenly nothing." I figured maybe the cable connection needed some attention. I stared at the impossible television, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. "Mr. Morrison, when was this TV installed?" "Oh, got it new in 1952, state-of-the-art back then. Course, we've had to have it worked on a few times over the years, keep it up to modern standards." I walked around the set, looking for any signs of modification or modern components that might explain how it was receiving and displaying a digital signal. The back panel showed the original vacuum tubes, all glowing with the warm orange light that marked genuine 1950 seconds electronics. But somehow, impossibly, it was pulling in crystal-clear digital cable programming. "Mr. Morrison," I said slowly, "I need to check the outside connections before I do anything else." "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need. I'll put some coffee on." Outside, I found the cable connection point on the side of the house. The installation was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Thick, coaxial cable that looked like it had been manufactured in the 1950 seconds, connected to a junction box that bore the logo of Beckley Telephone and Telegraph, a company that had been bought out and renamed 3 times since I'd been alive. But according to the signal meter on my equipment, it was carrying a perfect digital signal. I tried calling Rick on my cell phone to report what I was finding, but my phone showed no signal at all. Not low signal, no signal, like I was in a dead zone that didn't exist on any carrier's coverage map. I walked back toward my van, hoping to get enough distance from whatever was interfering with the signal, but as I moved away from the house, the road behind me started to fade like morning mist. Not disappear, fade, like someone was slowly turning down the contrast on a photograph. I could see my van parked in the driveway, but the road I'd driven up was becoming translucent, until I was looking at nothing but forest where asphalt and gravel should have been. I ran back toward the house, and the road solidified behind me with each step. Frank was standing on the porch, holding 2 cups of coffee, and watching my panic with what looked like sympathy. "Road's always been a little temperamental," he said, offering me one of the cups, "especially for folks who aren't supposed to be here." The coffee was strong and black, with the bitter edge that comes from beans ground fresh and brewed over an open fire. It was also the best coffee I'd ever tasted, rich and complex, in a way that made every cup I'd had before taste like dishwater. "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what is this place?" He settled into one of the rocking chairs on the porch and gestured for me to take the other. Here's the Morrison homestead. Been in my family since 1923, like I told you. My daddy, Earl Morrison, came back from the Great War and wanted to build something that would last. He found this spot and knew it was special. Places of power, the Cherokee used to call them. Spots where the world is thin, where time doesn't flow quite the same way it does everywhere else. I sat down heavily in the other chair, my legs suddenly feeling too weak to support me. "But our records show you've had cable service since 1952. "That's impossible." Frank took a sip of his coffee and rocked slowly, his eyes focused on something beyond the tree line. "Nothing's impossible here, son. Different rules apply. See, when my daddy built this place, he made a deal. The Cherokee had warned him about this ridge, said it was guarded, protected by something that didn't take kindly to strangers. But Earl Morrison was stubborn as they come, and he figured he could handle whatever was up here." The rocking chair creaked rhythmically as Frank continued his story, and I found myself getting drowsy despite the fear that was making my hands shake. The coffee, I realized. There was something in the coffee. The guardian of this place was a Cherokee man named Joseph Crow Feather, killed by coal company men in 1903 for refusing to sell his land. But death don't always mean the end, especially for someone who dies protecting something sacred. Joseph became what my abuela would call a vigilante, a watcher, bound to protect this ridge from anyone who would desecrate it. My vision was starting to blur, but Frank's voice remained clear and steady. My daddy made a deal with Joseph. The Morrison family could stay, could build their home here, but they had to serve as caretakers, had to make sure the old ways were preserved, make sure the sacred places stayed protected. And in return, Joseph would make sure we had everything we needed: food, shelter, and eventually, all the modern conveniences a family could want. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't obey. "What did you put in the coffee?" Frank's expression was genuinely apologetic. "Just something to help you relax, son. Cherokee medicine, from plants that still grow in the sacred grove. You're fighting what's happening, and that just makes it harder on everyone." "Fighting what?" I managed to ask, though my tongue felt thick and uncooperative. "Your new job," Frank said simply. "See, I've been the caretaker here for 70 years. Been dead for most of that time, technically speaking. Died of a heart attack in 1953, but Joseph wouldn't let me move on. Had to stay and tend to the responsibilities my family had taken on. But even the dead get tired, Danny. Even guardians need relief sometimes." The truth hit me like cold water, cutting through the drowsiness induced by whatever was in the coffee. The work orders. "You've been calling in service requests. Every few years, I call for a repairman. Someone skilled, someone who works with connections and communications, but most folks can't handle the truth of what this place is. They run, or they break, or they convince themselves they imagined it all. You're different, though. You've got the right spirit for this work. I tried to focus on his face, but it was changing as I watched. Sometimes he looked like the middle-aged man who'd greeted me, sometimes like an elderly person, and sometimes like a young man barely out of his teens. All the same person, but showing the age he'd been at different points in his impossible 70-year tenure as caretaker. "I can't stay here," I whispered. "I have a life, a job, people who depend on me." Frank nodded sadly. "That's what they all say. But Joseph doesn't give up his chosen easily. You've been selected, Danny. The work orders in your company's system, the service history, your route assignments. Joseph's been guiding you here for months. Every call you've taken in these mountains has been preparation, testing to see if you had the right temperament for this responsibility." As the drug in the coffee took full effect, I felt myself slipping away. But before I lost consciousness completely, I understood what was happening. The impossible service records, the perfect cable signal to a 1,950 seconds television, the road that existed only when needed. This place existed outside normal time, sustained by the will of a guardian spirit who had died protecting sacred ground. And now I was being chosen to take Frank's place, to become the new caretaker of this impossible homestead, to ensure that the old ways and the new ways could coexist in a pocket of mountain time that belonged to neither past nor present. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was lying on a simple bed in what appeared to be a back room of the cabin. Sunlight was streaming through windows that showed a view of mountains I didn't recognize, ranges that extended farther than the geography of West Virginia should have allowed. Frank was sitting in a chair beside the bed, looking like a man in his 40s now, wearing clothes that belonged to the 1,940 seconds. "Morning, Danny. Sorry about the rough transition, but there's no easy way to bring someone across to this side of things." I sat up slowly, my head pounding but my thinking clear. How long was I out? About 12 hours in your time, but time works different here. Could have been 12 minutes or 12 days, depending on how you look at it. Frank stood up and walked to the window. "Come see what you're going to be taking care of." I joined him at the window, and the view took my breath away. The cabin sat at the center of a valley that definitely hadn't existed the day before, surrounded by mountains covered in ancient forest. I could see other structures scattered throughout the valley, small cabins, a mill beside a stream, what looked like a traditional Cherokee village in a grove of massive trees. Smoke was rising from chimneys, and I could make out people moving around the various settlements. "What is this place?" "Sanctuary," Frank said simply. "A place where the old ways are preserved, where the spirits of the mountain can exist alongside the living, where time moves according to need rather than the calendar." Joseph Crowfeather created it in 1903 when he realized the coal companies were going to destroy everything sacred in these mountains. Every person you see down there is someone who was chosen, someone who became a caretaker of one part of the whole. I watched a woman hanging laundry outside one of the cabins, a perfectly normal domestic scene, except that the clothes she was hanging included both modern jeans and what looked like traditional Cherokee clothing. How many people live here? About 300, from all different time periods. Cherokee who died protecting the mountain, coal miners who were killed in company wars, mountain families who were displaced by strip mining, and folks like us who were chosen to help maintain the connections between this place and the outside world. Frank led me back to the living room, where the impossible television was still displaying current programming with crystal clarity. "Your job will be to maintain the communications infrastructure. Joseph needs to stay connected to the outside world, needs to know what's happening in the mountains beyond the sanctuary. The cable system, the telephone lines, the internet connections, all of it has to work perfectly, even though it's connecting a place that exists outside normal time to a world that follows the regular rules." I stared at the television, finally understanding. The service calls, the maintenance requests, you're keeping the sanctuary connected to the present day. Exactly. But it's not just about technology. You'll be the bridge between old and new, helping folks here adapt to changes in the outside world while making sure the sacred parts of the old ways are preserved. Frank's expression became serious. "It's important work, Danny. More important than you might realize. The coal companies never stopped trying to destroy these mountains. Now it's other corporations, other threats. But as long as the sanctuary exists, As long as the old ways are remembered and protected, the spirit of these mountains survives. Over the next several days, though time didn't seem to pass normally, with the sun rising and setting according to some schedule that had nothing to do with Earth's rotation, Frank showed me around the sanctuary. I met Cherokee elders who had died a century ago but continued to tend sacred groves, coal miners from the 1932nd who maintained the traditional mining techniques that worked with the mountain instead of against it, and mountain families from various eras who preserved the crafts and stories that kept the culture alive. Everyone I met had been chosen for specific skills that were needed to maintain the sanctuary. There was a doctor from the 1962nd who combined traditional Cherokee medicine with modern techniques, a blacksmith from the 1882nd who could repair anything mechanical, and a librarian from the 1992nd who cataloged and preserved all the stories and traditions that might otherwise be lost. And there was Joseph Crowfeather himself. I met him on my third day in the sanctuary, in a grove of ancient chestnuts where he tended a fire that had been burning since 1903. He appeared as a man in his 30s, wearing traditional Cherokee clothing but with eyes that held the weight of more than a century of guardianship. "Danny Rodriguez," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making life and death decisions. "Frank tells me you're ready to accept the responsibility of maintaining our connections to the outside world." I'd had 3 days to think about it, to explore the sanctuary and understand what I was being asked to do. The truth was, I'd never felt more at home anywhere in my life. The work was challenging and important, the community was unlike anything that existed in the regular world, and I was being offered the chance to help preserve something sacred and irreplaceable. "I understand what you're asking," I said. "But I need to know, can I ever leave? Can I visit my family? Let them know I'm okay?" Joseph nodded thoughtfully. "Time moves differently here, but it still moves. You can visit the outside world when needed, though you'll age more slowly here than you would there. Your family will eventually accept that you've moved away for work, found a new life in the mountains. It happens often enough that no one will question it too closely." He gestured toward the fire, which burned without consuming the wood that fed it. "The choice is yours, Danny. You can return to your old life, and we'll make sure you remember this as just a strange dream. Or you can accept the role of communications caretaker, help us maintain the bridge between old and new that keeps this sanctuary alive." I thought about my old life. The routine service calls, the apartment in Beckley, the job that paid the bills but never felt like it mattered. Then I looked around the grove, at the impossible trees and the eternal fire, at Joseph, whose dedication had preserved something sacred for more than a century. "I'll take the job," I said. Joseph smiled, the first real warmth I'd seen from him. "Then welcome home, Danny Rodriguez." That was 3 years ago. By outside time, I've learned to maintain communication systems that operate on principles of magic as much as technology, connecting a place that exists outside time to a world that's constantly changing. I help Cherokee elders use computers to preserve their language, teach coal miners from the 1932nd how to use cell phones to coordinate environmental protection efforts, and maintain cable connections that carry both current television programming and messages from the spirits of the mountain. Sometimes I do visit the outside world, taking my van down mountain roads that appear only when I need them, making service calls for Appalachian cable that help maintain the sanctuary's cover story. My old supervisor, Rick, thinks I've been assigned to a long-term project in the most remote parts of the mountains. My family believes I've found a good job that keeps me busy but happy. And I have found happiness in work that matters and a community that values both tradition and progress. Every day, I help maintain the connections that keep the sanctuary alive, that preserve the old ways while adapting to the new world's needs. It's the most important job I've ever had, even if it's one that officially doesn't exist. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes they also reveal their treasures to those willing to listen, to serve, and to understand that the most important work often happens in places the regular world can't see. I'm Danny Rodriguez, and I'm the communications caretaker for a place that exists between yesterday and tomorrow, where the spirit of Appalachia lives forever. Frank Morrison finally moved on last winter, his 70-year tenure as caretaker complete. Joseph Crowfeather told me he'd been waiting for the right replacement for decades, and that my skills with modern communication technology were exactly what the sanctuary needed for the challenges ahead. There are threats to these mountains that previous generations never had to face. Corporate interests that want to strip away everything sacred for short-term profit. But as long as the sanctuary exists, as long as the old ways are remembered and protected, the true spirit of Appalachia endures. And I'm proud to be part of that protection, maintaining the connections that keep the mountain's heart beating strong. Every morning I wake up in a cabin that shouldn't exist, in a valley that isn't on any map, surrounded by people who have chosen to serve something greater than themselves. And every morning I'm grateful to be exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing work that matters in ways the outside world could never understand. The mountains have always protected those who protect them. Now I'm part of that eternal guardianship, a bridge between the ancient wisdom of these hills and the modern world that still needs that wisdom to survive. I was 29 when I died at work, but I didn't know it for 3 years. My name's Jennifer Walsh, and I'd been working the overnight shift at Miller's Bakery here in Huntington, West Virginia, since I was 26. Not the most glamorous job, but it paid enough for me to afford my own place after my divorce. And honestly, I preferred the quiet. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., just me and the industrial ovens and whatever true crime podcast I wanted to play while I mixed dough and shaped loaves. The work was meditative in a way. Your hands learn the rhythm, the way dough feels when it's ready, the exact moment to pull bread from the oven before it overcooks. I grew up about an hour south in Gilbert, one of those coal towns where the mine closed and took half the population with it. Dad worked construction until his back gave out. Mom cleaned houses for Charleston lawyers who made more in a day than she did in a month. I was supposed to be the one who got out, went to college, made something of myself. Instead, I married Tommy Briggs right out of high school and spent 6 years learning that love doesn't pay bills and small-town boys don't always grow into men. After the divorce, I moved to Huntington with nothing but a Honda Civic and $300. The bakery job was the first place that called me back. Night shift meant I could avoid the daytime drama, the gossip, the way people looked at divorced women in towns like this. I was good with my hands, always had been. Used to help my grandmother make biscuits when I was little, rolling out dough on her floured counter while she told stories about the old days. I'd started doing Instagram live streams during my dinner breaks around midnight. Nothing fancy, just me talking to whoever was awake at that ungodly hour. Other night shift workers mostly, insomniacs, people working multiple jobs to make ends meet. I called it Midnight Baking with Jenny, even though I wasn't actually baking during the streams. Just eating my sandwich, talking about life, sometimes showing off whatever bread I'd made that night. I had maybe 200 followers, but they felt like family. People who understood what it was like to live when the rest of the world was sleeping. The stream started as a way to combat the loneliness. Working alone for 8 hours can mess with your head, especially in an old building like Miller's. It was built in the 1960 seconds, back when the chemical plants were booming and the town was growing. Thick brick walls, narrow windows, the kind of place that held onto shadows even during the day. At night, with just the security lights on, it felt like being buried alive. But I was good at the job. Really good. I could tell when dough needed more flour just by touching it, could time 6 different types of bread to finish at the same time, could troubleshoot the temperamental old ovens when they acted up. Mrs. Miller, who owned the place, said, I had baker's intuition. That thing some people are just born with. She'd hired me to fill a spot after their previous overnight baker, an older woman named Carol Hensley, had died in some kind of accident. Mrs. Miller never talked about it much, just said it was sudden and tragic and left it at that. That Tuesday night in October started normal. I clocked in at 10, checked the order sheet. Big dinner roll order for Mount Olive Baptist Church, 6 sandwich loaves for Tony's Deli, and a custom sourdough for some doctor's wife who only bought our bread. Nothing too complicated. I started with the dinner rolls since they needed the longest rise time, mixing the dough in the big Hobart mixer until it was smooth and elastic. I'd gotten into a rhythm over the years. Dinner rolls first, then sandwich bread, then whatever specialty items were on the list. Around midnight, I'd take my break, do my live stream, eat the sandwich I brought from home, Back to work until everything was shaped and in the ovens. Then I'd read or listened to podcasts while the bread baked. Final hour was cooling, packaging, cleaning up, clock out at 6, drive home as the sun came up, sleep until afternoon. But that Tuesday, around 11:30, I got restless. The dinner rolls were rising, the sandwich dough was mixed and resting, and I had 30 minutes to kill before I needed to shape anything. Usually I'd start my live stream from the break room, but I'd been feeling cooped up lately. Same four walls, same routine, same everything. My coworker Danny from the day shift had mentioned an old cabin up in the hills outside town. He was one of those local history buffs who knew every abandoned building and forgotten family story in a 50-mile radius. This particular cabin had belonged to the Hensleys, same last name as Carol, the baker who'd worked my shift before me. According to Danny, Carol's family had owned a hunting cabin up on Briars Fork Road, been in their family since the 1942. After Carol died, her kids had moved away and left the place empty. Still got power running to it, Danny had said. Family pays the bills out of some trust or something. Place is probably full of her stuff still. You know how mountain families are, they don't throw anything away. The idea of streaming from somewhere different appealed to me. My followers were always asking about life in West Virginia, about the mountains and the abandoned places. A real abandoned Appalachian cabin would be perfect content. I decided to drive up there during my break. 20 minutes up, 20 minutes back, 10 minutes to film. I'd still have time to get back and shape the sandwich loaves. The drive took me up winding mountain roads that got progressively narrower and darker. This was deep Appalachian country, thick forests of oak and maple, houses scattered so far apart you could go miles without seeing another light. The kind of place where families had lived for generations, where everyone knew everyone else's business going back 50 years. I found the cabin at the end of a gravel road that barely qualified as one lane. It was bigger than I'd expected. A 2-story log structure with a wraparound porch and stone chimney. Someone had maintained it well over the years. The roof looked solid, the windows weren't broken, and there was even a neat stack of firewood on the porch. I parked and started my stream at exactly 11:47 p.m. Hey, Night Owls, Jenny here, and I'm doing something different tonight. I held up my phone, panning across the cabin. My coworker told me about this old place up in the hills. Used to belong to a family called the Hensleys. Thought you guys might like to see a real, abandoned Appalachian cabin. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. Mountain folks often left hunting cabins and family places unlocked in case someone needed shelter. It was an old courtesy that went back generations. Going inside now, and wow, this place is like a time capsule. I stepped into the living room, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the space. Everything's still here. Family photos, furniture, even magazines on the coffee table. The cabin felt preserved rather than abandoned. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but nothing was broken or vandalized. Family photos lined the mantelpiece. Graduation pictures, Christmas mornings, hunting trips. I recognized the mountain backdrop in several shots. These people had deep roots here. Look at these old family photos. This must be from the 80 seconds and 90 seconds. I focused the camera on a picture of a middle-aged woman in a Miller's bakery uniform, standing next to an enormous wedding cake. Hey, this woman worked at my bakery. Small world, right? I moved into the kitchen, still streaming, talking to my followers about the preserved state of the place. That's when I smelled it. Fresh bread? Not the stale, musty smell you'd expect in an abandoned house, but the rich, yeasty aroma of bread that had just come out of the oven. Warm bread, with that perfect crust that crackles when it cools. Guys, this is really weird. I smell fresh bread in here. I looked around the kitchen with my phone light. There's actually a loaf of sourdough on the counter, and it's still warm. A perfect round loaf sat on a cooling rack next to the stove. Steam rose from tiny vents in the crust. I touched it gently, definitely warm, probably baked within the last hour. Maybe someone's been staying here? But there's no car outside. And look, I opened the oven door. Cold, not even a hint of residual heat. The oven's stone cold. How do you bake bread without an oven? I examined the kitchen more carefully. No dirty dishes, no flour on the counters, no sign that anyone had been cooking. But that bread was definitely real, definitely fresh. The smell is incredible though, better than anything we make at the bakery, and that's saying something. I breathed it in deeply. It smelled like my grandmother's kitchen when I was little, like comfort and home and everything good about childhood. I checked my phone, still 11:47 p.m. Wait, that's weird. My phone says I just started the stream, but I feel like I've been talking for 20 minutes. I stared at the screen. The timestamp hadn't moved. Is anyone else's clock running slow tonight? I tried to check the comments to see what my followers were saying about the time discrepancy, but the comments section wouldn't load, just a spinning wheel where the chat should be. My comments aren't loading, must be bad reception up here in the mountains. I tried refreshing the app, but nothing changed. The viewer count showed 15 people watching, but I couldn't see any actual comments. That's when I noticed something else strange. My phone battery was at 73%, the exact same percentage it had been when I started the stream. After 20 minutes of recording video with the flashlight on, it should have dropped significantly. This is getting weird, guys. My battery isn't draining, my clock isn't moving, and there's fresh bread in an abandoned cabin. I tried to laugh it off, but unease was creeping up my spine. Let me check upstairs real quick, then I need to get back to work. I climbed the narrow wooden staircase, my footsteps echoing strangely in the empty house. The second floor had 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, all preserved like the rest of the house. In the master bedroom, I found something that made my blood run cold. Work uniforms hanging in the closet, Miller's Bakery polo shirts with embroidered name tags. Carol, they all said. Carol Hensley. Guys, I found work uniforms for the woman who used to work my shift at the bakery. I held one up to the camera. She died a few years ago. I took over her position. But why would she keep her work clothes at a hunting cabin? That's when I noticed the other clothes in the closet. More Miller's Bakery uniforms, but these had different names. Names I didn't recognize. How many people had worked my shift over the years? The bread smell was getting stronger, filling the entire house with that rich, yeasty aroma. It reminded me of the bakery during busy periods, when all 6 ovens were running at once and the air was thick with the smell of rising dough. But I was standing in an empty cabin with no power. I went back downstairs, increasingly confused. The sourdough loaf was still on the counter, still warm. But now there were other loaves too. Dinner rolls cooling on racks, sandwich bread wrapped in brown paper, an entire bakery's worth of fresh bread, all impossibly perfect. I don't understand what's happening here. My voice was getting shaky. There's fresh bread everywhere now, but there's no way to bake anything in this cabin. I tried to think about my work schedule, about what time I needed to be back to shape the sandwich loaves, but I couldn't remember what I'd left rising in the bakery. Couldn't remember the order list or what needed to be finished that night. Actually, I couldn't remember driving to the cabin either. The memory felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I need to get back to work, but I can't remember what I was making tonight. I stared at my phone, still showing 11:47 p.m. I can't remember my schedule, or what day it is, or how long my break is supposed to be. The bread smell was overwhelming now, making it hard to think. Every breath I took filled my lungs with that warm, yeasty aroma, but underneath it was something else. Something that smelled like smoke. Wait, do I actually work at Miller's Bakery? I looked down at my uniform, the polo shirt with my name embroidered on it, Jennifer Walsh, but the letters looked strange, like they didn't quite belong there. I tried to remember my last shift, clocking in at 10, checking the order sheet, starting the dinner rolls, but the memory felt manufactured, like something I'd imagined rather than lived. Every time I try to think about work, I just smell bread and hear ovens running. It was true. Whenever I focused on the bakery, I could hear the distinctive hum of industrial ovens, the beeping of timers, the whir of mixers. But I was standing in a silent cabin in the middle of nowhere. The sound was getting louder. Ovens running, timers going off, the crash and bang of industrial baking, like the entire bakery was operating at full capacity just outside the cabin walls. I think I've been here longer than I realized. My phone still says 11:47, but that's impossible. I walked back to the kitchen, where even more bread had appeared. Loaves and rolls and pastries covering every surface, all warm, all perfect. In my confused state, I barely noticed that the bread smell had gotten stronger, more acrid. That what I'd been interpreting as the rich aroma of baking bread was actually the choking smell of smoke, of flour dust igniting, of old wood and electrical wiring burning. I tried to call up a clear memory of anything, my apartment, my car, my life. But everything felt fuzzy, uncertain, like looking at the world through thick glass. I can't remember my name, the words came out in a whisper. I know I'm streaming, but I don't know who I am. That's when I saw the newspaper clipping on the kitchen table. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to glow in my phone's light. Asterisk, asterisk, local baker dies in tragic fire. Asterisk, 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 Jennifer Walsh, 29. Killed when electrical fault ignites flour dust at Miller's Bakery. Asterisk. There was a picture of me, younger, smiling, holding a tray of dinner rolls. The article was dated 3 years ago. 3 years ago, Miller's Bakery experienced a devastating fire that claimed the life of overnight baker Jennifer Walsh. Walsh, who had worked the night shift for 3 years, died when an electrical fault in one of the aging ovens ignited airborne flour dust, causing a flash fire that spread rapidly through the building. Walsh was found at her workstation, apparently having stayed to finish a large order of dinner rolls for Mount Olive Baptist Church despite the growing danger. She was pronounced dead at the scene from smoke inhalation. I read it twice, 3 times, the words wouldn't sink in. The fire occurred at approximately 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October. Walsh had been alone in the building, working her regular overnight shift. Security footage showed her continuing to work even as smoke began filling the building, apparently unaware of the danger until it was too late. My hands were shaking as I held the phone. The live stream was still running, still showing 15 viewers, still locked at 11:47 p.m. Survivors include her parents, Robert and Linda Walsh of Gilbert, and her ex-husband, Thomas Briggs. Walsh was known for her dedication to her work and her popular social media presence, where she shared her love of baking with followers around the world. The memory came back in pieces. The smell of smoke that I'd dismissed as normal bakery smells, the electrical spark from the old oven that I'd thought was just another quirk of the aging equipment, the way the flour dust caught fire and spread faster than seemed possible. I remembered trying to save the dinner rolls, the custom order that Mount Olive Baptist was counting on for their Wednesday night supper. Remembered thinking I had time, that I could finish the batch and get them safely in the ovens before dealing with whatever was causing the smoke. I remembered the moment I realized I was wrong. The flash of heat, the wall of flame, the way the smoke filled my lungs and made everything go dark. And I remembered something else. In those final moments, as consciousness faded, I remembered thinking about my followers, about the people who counted on my midnight streams to get them through their lonely nights, about how they'd wonder where I was. I died in a bakery fire 3 years ago, I said to my phone, to the 15 viewers who weren't really viewers at all. But I kept showing up for work anyway. I kept doing my streams. Because the bread had to be baked, and people were counting on me. I understood now. The cabin wasn't abandoned. It was a way station, a place where people like me could exist between worlds. Carol Hensley had been here before me, and others before her. All the overnight workers who died alone, who'd stayed too long at jobs that didn't pay enough but meant everything to them anyway. The bread on the counters wasn't real bread. It was the echo of all the bread we'd made in life, all the late-night batches and early morning rushes and custom orders that we'd died trying to fulfill. The 15 people watching my stream, they're not alive either, are they? I looked at the viewer count, understanding finally who my audience really was. Night shift workers who'd died alone, security guards who'd had heart attacks in empty buildings, nurses who'd worked themselves to death, waitresses who'd never made it home after closing. We were all still working our shifts, still broadcasting to each other across whatever space exists between life and death. Still trying to fulfill orders that would never be picked up, still serving customers who would never come. My stream was ending automatically, the way it always did. But I knew it would start again tomorrow night at 11:47 p.m., and the night after that, and the night after that, because the bread had to be baked, the orders had to be filled, the work had to go on, even if we were all dead. Asterisk, asterisk, epilogue, asterisk, asterisk. The hiker, who found the phone 3 days later, was named Marcus Chen, a graduate student studying Appalachian folklore. He'd been documenting abandoned structures for his thesis when he came across the old Hensley cabin. The phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, still warm, battery at 73%. When Marcus tried to unlock it, it opened automatically to a paused livestream titled Midnight Baking with Jenny. The last frame showed an empty kitchen with bread covering every surface. Marcus reported his find to the local authorities, who identified the phone as belonging to Jennifer Walsh, a woman who had died in a bakery fire 3 years earlier. Her phone had been recovered from the fire scene, damaged beyond repair. How an identical device had ended up in an abandoned cabin miles away remained unexplained. But that's not the strangest part of the story. Other night shift workers in Huntington, security guards, hospital staff, convenience store clerks, began reporting a phenomenon. Around 11:47 p.m. on random Tuesday nights, their phones would automatically connect to an Instagram live stream from an account called @JennyBakes29. The stream always showed the same thing: a young woman standing in what appeared to be an abandoned cabin, surrounded by fresh bread, talking to an audience that never responded. The viewer count always showed exactly 15 people watching. The timestamp never moved from 11:47 p.m., and if you listened carefully, underneath Jennifer's voice, you could hear the sound of industrial ovens running, timers beeping, and the gentle hum of bread rising in the endless night. The stream always ended the same way, with Jennifer saying the words that had become her eternal routine. "I died in a bakery fire 3 years ago, but I kept showing up for work anyway. Because the bread has to be baked, the orders have to be filled, the work has to go on." Then the screen would go black, and the night shift workers would return to their own endless routines, their own vigils in the dark, wondering if they too would one day find themselves broadcasting from the space between life and death, still trying to serve customers who would never come. In the mountains of West Virginia, where families have worked the same jobs for generations, and where dedication to duty runs deeper than death, Jennifer Walsh continues her overnight shift. Every Tuesday at 11:47 p.m., she clocks into a bakery that no longer exists, serving an audience of the dead, making bread for orders that will never be filled. Because in Appalachia, some things are more important than being alive, and work never really ends. I'm 34, and I've been working as an insurance claims adjuster for the past 12 years. Started right out of college with a business degree that wasn't getting me anywhere else, and honestly, I figured it would be temporary. But the work was steady, the pay was decent, and I was good at it, really good. I had this knack for spotting fraudulent claims and getting legitimate ones processed fast, which made me popular with both the company and the clients. My supervisor always said I had the best instincts in the department. Most days, I'd drive around central Kentucky, looking at storm damage, house fires, minor accidents, routine stuff that required documentation and assessment. I'd gotten used to dealing with people on the worst days of their lives, and I'd learned how to be professional but compassionate. After 12 years, I thought I'd seen everything. Property damage from tornadoes, mysterious barn fires, claims from families who'd lost everything. I'd written thousands of reports, taken tens of thousands of photos, and never once filed something I couldn't explain or document properly. That Tuesday morning in October started like any other day. I had 3 claims to assess: 2 minor fender benders in Lexington, and 1 property claim way out in the mountains near a place called Birch Creek. The property claim was straightforward. Elderly woman named Harold Birch had died the month before, and his nephew from Louisville had inherited a cabin. The nephew needed a damage assessment for insurance coverage before he could decide whether to keep the place or sell it. Routine paperwork said there was possible roof damage and water intrusion from the heavy rains we'd had all September. The drive up to Birch Creek took about 2 hours, winding through hills that got steeper and more isolated the further east I went. I'd been working these mountain communities for years, so the narrow roads and remote locations didn't bother me. If anything, I enjoyed getting out of the city for a few hours, seeing some real countryside. The cabin was about 5 miles past the tiny town of Birch Creek, down a gravel road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. GPS lost signal about a mile in, but the directions were clear enough. When I pulled up to the cabin around 10:30 that morning, it looked exactly like what I'd expected. Single-story log construction, probably built in the 1,940 seconds, or 50 seconds. Green metal roof with a few loose panels, front porch sagging slightly on the left side. Nothing that screamed major damage, just the kind of wear and tear you'd expect from a building that had housed an elderly man living alone for decades. The property was neat, though garden still partially maintained, woodpile stacked properly, no junk or debris scattered around. Harold Birch had clearly taken care of the place right up until he died. I grabbed my camera, clipboard, and measuring tape from the trunk and approached the front door. The nephew had left a key under a loose board on the porch, exactly where he'd said it would be. Standard procedure for these inherited property assessments. I'd done dozens of them over the years. Family member dies, relatives need to know what they're inheriting before they make decisions about keeping or selling. Usually, took about an hour to document everything properly. The key turned easily in the lock, and I stepped inside expecting to smell that typical combination of old wood, dust, and whatever cleaning products the previous owner had preferred. Instead, the air inside felt different somehow. Not bad, exactly, just thick, like the atmosphere was heavier than it should be. I'd been in plenty of houses where elderly people had lived alone for years, and they all had their own particular smell and feel. This was something else. I set my clipboard on a small table by the front door and started taking preliminary photos of the main room. Living room was tidy, furniture arranged neatly, everything clean. No sign of water damage from the roof issues I was supposed to be documenting. I moved toward the kitchen, taking pictures of the walls and ceiling, looking for water stains or structural problems. That's when I noticed my hands. I was adjusting the camera settings when I glanced down and saw brown spots on the backs of my hands that hadn't been there that morning. At first, I thought maybe I'd gotten something on them during the drive. Mud or tree sap from brushing against something outside. But when I looked closer, the spots looked like age spots. The kind my grandfather had developed in his 70s. I went to the kitchen sink and tried washing them off, but the spots stayed put. When I looked up at my reflection in the window over the sink, my face looked different too. Older. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there when I'd shaved that morning, and my hair looked grayer at the temples. My first thought was that the lighting in the cabin was playing tricks on me. Old windows, dim interior, maybe some kind of tinted glass that was affecting how I saw colors. I'd been in plenty of buildings with weird lighting that made people look sick or older than they were. But when I held my hands up to compare the backs with the palms, the difference was obvious. The backs of my hands looked like they belonged to someone 20 years older than me. I stepped back from the sink and checked my watch. I'd been inside the cabin for maybe 10 minutes. I took a deep breath and tried to think logically about what could be causing this. Maybe I was having some kind of allergic reaction to something in the air. Old houses sometimes had mold or chemical residue that could cause skin discoloration. Maybe the stress of the busy work week was finally catching up to me, making me see things that weren't really there. But when I looked at my reflection again, the changes were more pronounced. My face looked definitely older, with deeper lines around my mouth and eyes. My hair was noticeably grayer, and my skin had that slightly weathered look that comes with age. I decided to continue with the assessment and get out of the cabin as quickly as possible. Whatever was happening to me, I could deal with it once I was back in my truck and had cell phone service. I moved toward the hallway that led to what I assumed were the bedrooms, taking photos as I went and trying to ignore the growing sense that something was seriously wrong. The hallway had several framed photographs hanging on the walls. Family pictures spanning what looked like several decades. As I walked past them, documenting potential water damage to the ceiling, I glanced at the photos and stopped dead in my tracks. One of the photos showed a man who looked exactly like me. Not similar to me, exactly like me. Same face, same build, even the same posture. But the man in the photo was clearly elderly, probably in his 80s, standing next to a woman in front of this same cabin. The photo looked like it had been taken recently, within the last few years, based on the quality and the clothing. I looked closer at the other photos and realized they seemed to show the same man at different ages. A young man who looked like me in his 20s, standing with a young woman. The same man in his 30s and 40s, with the woman and 2 children. The man in his 50s and 60s, children grown and gone. And finally, the elderly man standing alone in front of the cabin. My hands were shaking as I took pictures of the photographs. This had to be Harold Birch, the man who died last month. But the resemblance was impossible. People don't look that similar unless they're closely related, and I'd never heard the name Birch before this assignment. I'd certainly never been to this part of Kentucky before today. I continued down the hallway, trying to focus on my job, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at pictures of my own life, or a life I might have lived. When I reached the bathroom at the end of the hall, I looked at myself in the mirror and gasped. I was definitely older. Significantly older. The man looking back at me appeared to be in his 50s, with gray hair, deep wrinkles, and age spots covering his hands and face. This wasn't a trick of lighting or an allergic reaction. I was physically aging, rapidly, while standing inside this cabin. I tried to leave immediately. I turned around and headed back toward the front door. But with each step I took, I could feel my body changing more dramatically. My back started to ache and curve forward. My knees began to creak and stiffen. By the time I reached the living room, I was moving like a man in his 70s. I looked at my watch again. I'd been inside the cabin for about 30 minutes. In that time, I'd aged what felt like 40 years. My driver's license was in my back pocket, and when I pulled it out, the photo showed an elderly man. The birth date had changed from 1989 to 1936. The name was still Marcus Thompson, but according to this ID, I was 87 years old. My cell phone was in my jacket pocket, and when I managed to get it out with my now arthritic hands, I saw that it showed several missed calls from work. The caller ID showed that people had been trying to reach Harold Birch, not Marcus Thompson. When I tried to call my office, the receptionist told me that Marcus Thompson had retired 15 years ago and had died the previous month. I realized then that the cabin wasn't just aging my body, it was erasing my actual life and replacing it with Harold Birch's life. I was becoming him, completely. My memories of being a 3-4-year-old insurance adjuster were starting to fade, being replaced by memories of Harold's 87 years in this cabin. I could remember his wife, Martha, dying of cancer 20 years ago. I could remember his children moving away and rarely visiting. I could remember decades of loneliness in this isolated mountain cabin. The aging continued to accelerate. Every minute I stayed inside made me older and pushed more of Harold's memories into my head while my own memories faded. I tried again to leave, but each step toward the door made the transformation happen faster. When I reached for the door handle, my hands were so arthritic I could barely grip it, and my vision was becoming cloudy with cataracts. I understood then that the cabin was designed to trap people and transform them into Harold Birch. Harold had died, but somehow his essence or his need for companionship had remained tied to the building. Anyone who entered would begin to become him, taking on his physical form and memories while their own identity disappeared. I'm writing this report with hands that shake from age and arthritis that developed in the past 3 hours. My phone shows that I've been in this cabin for 3.5 hours, but my body has experienced over 50 years of aging. I've tried calling for help, but everyone who answers the phone recognizes me as Harold Birch, who they say died last month. The worst part isn't the physical aging, it's the loss of my own identity. I can barely remember what my apartment in Louisville looked like. I can't remember my colleagues' names or the cases I was working on. Harold's memories are taking over completely, and soon there won't be any trace left of Marcus Thompson. If someone finds this report, know that Marcus Thompson came to assess property damage at the Harold Birch cabin on October 15th and became Harold Birch instead. The cabin won't let its owner die permanently. It keeps him alive by stealing the lives of anyone who enters and turning them into him. I can feel my heart weakening with each beat. At this rate, I'll die of old age within the next hour, just like Harold did last month. But Harold's essence will remain in the cabin, waiting for the next person to inherit this property and need an insurance assessment. The nephew from Louisville will eventually come to check on why his insurance adjuster never filed a report. And when he does, the cabin will have a new visitor to transform into its permanent resident. I'm leaving this report on the kitchen table, hoping someone will find it and understand what happened here. Don't come inside this cabin. Don't try to help Harold Birch, because Harold Birch doesn't want help. He wants company, and he'll take it by stealing your life and making you become him. My name was Marcus Thompson. I was 34 years old and worked as an insurance claims adjuster. I came here to do my job and document property damage. Instead, I became Harold Birch, and Harold Birch will die again today, only to live again the next time someone inherits this cabin and needs it assessed. The cycle will continue until someone finds a way to break it, or until the cabin finally collapses and takes Harold's essence with it. Until then, anyone who enters will lose their life and their identity to become the lonely old man who refuses to stay dead in this isolated mountain cabin. My name's Patricia Miller, and I've been working as a state park ranger for going on 8 years now. Started when I was 23. Fresh out of college with a forestry degree and this romantic idea about protecting nature and helping people connect with the wilderness. Kanawha State Forest in West Virginia became my home away from home. 9,300 acres of dense hardwood forest, steep ridges, and winding trails that most folks only see during their weekend camping trips. But I knew every inch of those woods, or at least I thought I did. I'd grown up about 30 miles south in a little town called Beckley, so the mountains were in my blood. My dad used to take me hunting when I was a kid, taught me to read tracks and signs, how to move quiet through the trees. That knowledge served me well in my job, made me good at finding lost hikers and spotting problems before they got out of hand. What happened 3 years ago, though, in October of 2022, made me realize there were things in those mountains that no amount of training could prepare you for. I was 31 at the time, living in a small cabin about 10 minutes from the main ranger station. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom place with a wood stove and a porch that looked out into the trees, but it was mine, and I loved waking up to the sound of wind through the leaves and the smell of mountain air. I'd been single for about 2 years after my engagement fell apart, and honestly, I preferred the solitude. The forest felt safer than people most days. My job kept me busy enough. Daily patrols, maintaining trails, educational programs for school groups, and the occasional search and rescue operation when some weekend warrior got in over their head. The other rangers were good people. My supervisor, Bill Hutchins, had been working the forest for almost 20 years and knew more about those woods than anyone alive. There was also Jake Morrison, who was about my age and had started just 6 months after me, and Sarah Chen, our newest hire who'd transferred from a park out in Colorado. We worked well as a team, covering different sections of the forest and coordinating through radio check-ins every few hours. The radio system was our lifeline. Old but reliable Motorola units that could reach the base station from anywhere in the forest as long as you weren't too deep in a hollow or blocked by too many ridges. October had been unusually quiet that year. The leaves were at peak color, drawing decent crowds during the day, but by evening the forest emptied out fast. Locals knew better than to be in the woods after dark during hunting season, and the tourists stuck to the main campground areas. That's why the missing hiker report that came in on October 15th was so strange. A man named David Kellerman had been reported overdue by his wife after failing to return from what was supposed to be a day hike on the Spotted Salamander Trail. He'd left his car at the trailhead around noon, telling her he'd be back by 6 for dinner. When he didn't show up by 10 that night, she called it in. The Spotted Salamander Trail wasn't particularly challenging, about 4 miles of well-marked path that looped through some of the prettier sections of the forest. It was the kind of hike that experienced outdoorsmen could do in their sleep. According to his wife, David was an avid hiker who knew his way around the mountains. He had proper gear, a GPS unit, and enough experience to handle himself if he got turned around. Still, things happen. People take shortcuts, twist ankles, have heart attacks. It was our job to find them and bring them home. Bill organized the search for the next morning, dividing the forest into grid sections and assigning each of us a patrol area. I drew Section J-12, which covered the eastern portion of the Spotted Salamander Trail and extended into some of the more remote areas where someone might end up if they'd gotten confused or tried to take an unmarked path. It was rough terrain, steep ridges, dense understory, and a few old mining roads that hadn't been maintained in decades. If David had wandered off the main trail, this would be prime territory for someone to get seriously lost. I started my search around sunrise, working systematically through my assigned grid with my radio, first aid kit, and emergency gear. The morning was crisp and clear, with that perfect autumn light filtering through the canopy and highlighting the reds and golds of the changing leaves. It felt like any other search operation at first, calling David's name, looking for disturbed vegetation or dropped gear, checking the obvious places someone might go for water or shelter. For the first few hours, I found nothing but the usual forest debris and some old deer sign. It was around noon when I picked up the first set of tracks that didn't look quite right. I was working my way along an old logging road about 2 miles from the main trail when I spotted what looked like boot prints in the soft earth near a creek crossing. They were definitely human-made. I could see the distinctive tread pattern of hiking boots. But something about them bothered me. The stride length was longer than normal, like whoever made them was taking unusually large steps or possibly running. More concerning was the depth of the impressions. They were pressed deep into the mud, deeper than you'd expect from someone David's size just walking normally. I followed the tracks for about a quarter mile, radioing in my position and findings to the base station. The prints led away from any established trail, heading up a steep ridge towards some of the most remote parts of the forest. That's when I started noticing other things that didn't add up. The tracks showed David moving in an almost straight line up the ridge, not following the natural contours of the land like an experienced hiker would. There were no signs that he'd stopped to rest, check his position, or even navigate around obstacles. It was like he'd been moving with unusual determination toward some specific destination. About halfway up the ridge, the boot prints started getting mixed up with other impressions in the soft ground. At first, I thought it might be deer sign or maybe black bear tracks. We had a healthy population of both in the forest. But when I knelt down for a closer look, the hair on the back of my neck started to prickle. These weren't like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were elongated, almost human-like in shape, but much larger, with what looked like claw marks instead of toe impressions. The stride length between them was enormous, at least 8 feet between steps, and they seemed to be following the same path as David's boots. I've seen a lot of weird things in the woods over the years. Bears walking on their hind legs can leave prints that look almost human from a distance. Erosion can distort track shapes and make normal impressions look strange. But these prints had a deliberate quality to them, a consistency that made my stomach start to twist with unease. Whatever had made them was walking upright like a person, but was much larger than any human, and it was following the exact same route that David had taken. I radioed base station to report my findings, trying to keep my voice professional despite the growing sense of wrongness I was feeling. Bill's response was typical: stay on the trail, document what I could, and keep looking for signs of the missing hiker. Standard protocol was to assume normal explanations until proven otherwise. Maybe David had encountered a bear and changed direction. Maybe the tracks were older than they appeared and just coincidentally in the same area. Maybe the unusual impressions were caused by something mundane that I wasn't seeing clearly. But as I continued following the track, that sense of wrongness only got stronger. The smell hit me first. A thick, musky odor like wet dog mixed with something rotten. It was strong enough to make my eyes water, and unlike anything I'd encountered in 8 years of working these mountains. Black bears had a distinctive smell, but this was different, heavier, more animal but also somehow wrong, like meat that had been left out too long in the heat. The sound came next, heavy, rhythmic breathing that seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead of me on the ridge. It was too deep and too regular to be any wildlife I knew. Not the quick panting of a scared deer or the huffing of an agitated bear. This was slow, controlled breathing, like something large and intelligent taking its time. Every instinct I'd developed over years in the forest was telling me to turn around, get back to my vehicle, and radio for backup. But David Kellerman was still missing, and those boot prints were leading me in the same direction as that breathing. I checked my equipment and continued up the ridge, moving as quietly as I could and stopping frequently to listen. My radio was picking up more static than usual, crackling with interference every few minutes for no reason I could identify. The GPS unit was working fine, showing my position clearly on the topographic map, but something about the whole situation felt wrong in a way I couldn't put into words. That's when I saw it through the trees ahead of me, standing perfectly still, about 50 yards up the ridge. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. It was huge, at least 12 feet tall, and covered in dark, matted hair that looked almost black in the filtered sunlight, but it wasn't moving like any animal I'd ever seen. It was standing completely upright on 2 legs, motionless, watching me through the trees with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like mirrors even in the daylight. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for my radio, while my mind raced to come up with some rational explanation for what I was seeing. Maybe it was a person in some kind of costume. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs, and the distance was playing tricks on my perception. Maybe I was having some kind of medical episode and hallucinating. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was looking at, every survival instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. The breathing had stopped when I'd spotted it. This thing, whatever it was, knew I was there and was deciding what to do about me. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure it could hear it. Then, without warning, it moved. Not toward me or away from me, but to the side, circling my position while staying just at the edge of clear visibility through the trees. I fumbled for my radio with shaking hands, trying to maintain visual contact with the creature while calling for backup. Base, this is Ranger Miller on Patrol 7. I managed to get out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I need immediate backup at grid reference J12. I'm tracking what I thought was a missing hiker, but I've encountered something that doesn't match any wildlife in this region. Bill's voice came back through the static. Copy that, Patricia. What's your situation? I watched the creature continue its slow circle around my position, moving with a deliberate intelligence that made my skin crawl. The missing hiker's tracks are mixed with prints from something else, something large that walks upright but isn't human. I have visual contact with what appears to be the source of the unknown tracks. There was a pause before Bill responded. Patricia, are you saying you're looking at a bear? Negative, Base. This is not a bear. It's approximately 12 feet tall, bipedal, and it's exhibiting hunting behavior. It's circling my position and appears to be intelligent enough to use tactics. The radio crackled with more static, and when Bill's voice came through again, it was broken and hard to understand. Copy. Stay in position. Sending backup. I tried to respond, but my radio was now picking up nothing but interference. Every time the creature moved closer to my position, the static got worse, like something about it was affecting my electronic equipment. I checked my GPS unit and found it was showing my location accurately, but the radio was essentially useless. The creature had completed one full circle around me and was starting on a second when it began making sounds. Not animal sounds like growling or roaring, but something that sounded almost like speech, like someone with a severely damaged throat trying to form words. The sounds were coming from different directions now, and I realized with growing horror that there might be more than one of these things. I started backing down the ridge toward where I'd left my patrol vehicle, trying to keep the original creature in sight while listening for signs of others. The breathing sounds were coming from multiple directions now, and I could hear the deliberate snapping of branches as they moved through the forest. Not the random breaking you'd hear from normal wildlife, but purposeful sounds meant to let me know they were there without showing themselves clearly. As I retreated, I found more evidence of what these creatures had been doing in this part of the forest. There were bones scattered around what looked like a hunting camp. Deer, bear, smaller mammals. But they were arranged in patterns that no natural predator would create. They'd been deliberately placed in geometric arrangements around the base of several large trees, like territorial markers or some kind of display. The scratch marks on the trees went up at least 15 feet, carved deep into the bark in parallel lines that could only have been made by claws. These weren't random bear scratches or damage from storms. They were systematic markings that covered several acres, like the creatures were claiming this entire section of the forest as their hunting territory. I was still about half a mile from my vehicle when I realized they were hurting me. Every time I tried to change direction or take a more direct route back to the road, I'd hear movement that pushed me back toward the path they wanted me to take. They were coordinating their movements, using the terrain to channel me toward something specific. And I was pretty sure I knew what that something was. My patrol vehicle was parked at the end of an old mining road, the only way in or out of this section of the forest by car. If these creatures had been watching our patrol routines, and their behavior suggested an intelligence capable of that kind of planning, they would know that any ranger working this grid would have to return to that exact spot. They weren't just hunting opportunistically, they were using the missing hiker report as bait to lure one of us into their territory where they could eliminate the threat we represented. The reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. David Kellerman wasn't lost. He was dead. And these creatures had arranged his disappearance to draw a search team into their hunting ground. They'd been watching us, learning our procedures, waiting for the right opportunity to deal with the humans who might expose their presence in these mountains. I could see my patrol vehicle through the trees ahead, but there was something large standing next to it. Another one of the creatures, waiting for me to approach. My radio was still nothing but static. My backup was at least an hour away, even if they'd understood my last transmission. And I was trapped between multiple intelligent predators in terrain they knew better than I did. I had two choices: try to reach the vehicle and hope I could get past whatever was waiting for me, or go deeper into the forest and try to find another way out. Neither option seemed likely to end well, but staying where I was definitely wouldn't work. I could hear them moving closer, their breathing and deliberate sounds converging on my position from 3 different directions. I decided to go for the vehicle. It was my best chance of getting out alive and warning others about what was hunting in these mountains. I checked my sidearm, a .40 caliber Glock that I'd never had to draw on anything bigger than an aggressive bear, and started moving toward the road as quietly as I could. The creature by my vehicle was even larger than the first one I'd seen, easily 13 feet tall and massively built through the chest and shoulders. It was standing motionless beside the driver's door, watching the tree line where it expected me to emerge. As I got closer, I could see more details that made my stomach turn. Its face was almost human-like, but elongated, with a jaw that protruded too far and revealed too many teeth when it opened its mouth. Its hands were enormous, with fingers that ended in claws at least 6 inches long. I was about 20 yards from the vehicle when the creature turned its head and looked directly at me. Those reflected eyes locked onto mine, and I could see intelligence there that was far beyond any animal. It knew exactly what I was, why I was there, and what I was trying to do. For a moment, we just stared at each other across that small clearing, predator and prey both calculating our next moves. Then it opened its mouth and made that sound again, that horrible attempt at human speech that raised every hair on my body. This time, though, I could make out what it was trying to say. In a voice like gravel and broken glass, it was saying my name, Patricia. That's when I ran, not toward the vehicle, but back into the forest, crashing through the underbrush with no plan except getting as far away as possible from something that knew who I was. Behind me, I could hear multiple sets of footsteps in pursuit, heavy impacts that shook the ground and broke through vegetation like it wasn't even there. I ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my radio bouncing against my hip and my equipment getting caught on every branch and thorn bush. The sounds of pursuit stayed with me but never got closer, and I realized they were still hurting me. Even in full flight, they were controlling where I went, pushing me towards some destination that I couldn't see but that they had planned in advance. I broke through a line of trees into a small clearing and found myself in what looked like a natural amphitheater. A depression in the ridge, surrounded by steep slopes on all sides, and scattered around the clearing were personal belongings. Backpacks, water bottles, pieces of clothing, items that belonged to hikers who had gone missing in these mountains over the past several months. In the center of the clearing, arranged in that same geometric pattern I'd seen with the animal bones, were human remains. Not fresh, but not old enough to be completely cleaned by scavengers. I could see enough to know that David Kellerman and at least 2 other missing hikers had ended up here. And judging by the condition of the remains, they hadn't died quickly or easily. The creatures emerged from the tree line around the clearing, moving slowly and deliberately now that they had me where they wanted me. There were 5 of them, all massive and covered in that same dark, matted hair. They arranged themselves around the perimeter of the clearing like they were performing some kind of ritual. And I realized that this wasn't just about hunting for food. This was about territory, about eliminating threats to their domain, about maintaining their secret existence in these mountains. I drew my sidearm, knowing it was probably useless against creatures of this size but needing to do something. The largest one, the one that had been by my vehicle, stepped forward and made that horrible sound again. This time it wasn't trying to say my name. It was speaking in sentences, broken and barely intelligible, but unmistakably attempting communication. Rangers, find us. It rasped, the words coming out in pieces like it was remembering how human speech worked. Rangers, tell others, no more. Rangers. I understood then that this had been happening for a while. These creatures had been systematically targeting anyone who might discover their presence and spread word to the outside world. Park rangers, hikers, hunters, anyone who spent enough time in the deep forest to stumble across evidence of their existence. The missing hiker reports weren't random disappearances, they were targeted eliminations. I fired 3 shots at the largest creature, aiming center mass like I'd been trained. The bullets hit, I could see the impact, but they barely seemed to notice. If anything, the gunshots just made them more agitated. They started moving in closer, and I knew I was about to join the remains scattered around that clearing. That's when I heard the helicopter. The sound of rotor blades cutting through the air echoed off the ridges, and I could see the confusion in the creature's movements. They weren't used to that kind of noise, that kind of intrusion into their territory. Bill must have gotten enough of my radio transmission to call for air support, and the West Virginia State Police helicopter was somewhere overhead looking for me. I started shouting at the top of my lungs, firing my remaining rounds into the air as signal shots while the creatures milled around in obvious distress. They couldn't complete whatever they'd planned to do to me with that helicopter circling overhead, couldn't risk being seen by the crew. One by one, they melted back into the forest, moving with that same deliberate intelligence, but clearly frustrated by the interruption. The helicopter found me 20 minutes later, winching me up from the clearing, while I clutched David Kellerman's wallet and tried to explain what I'd found. The crew was professional and efficient, but I could see in their faces that they thought I was suffering from shock or exposure. The story I was telling didn't match anything in their experience or training. The official report listed David Kellerman and the other missing hikers as victims of animal attacks, probably black bears. The remains we recovered from the clearing were too damaged for detailed forensic analysis, and my account of the incident was attributed to stress and possible concussion from my fall while fleeing the bear attack. The geometric arrangement of bones and personal belongings was explained as coincidental, scattering by scavengers. I was placed on administrative leave for 2 weeks and required to undergo psychological evaluation before returning to duty. The department psychiatrist was understanding but clear. Trauma could cause people to see and remember things that didn't actually happen. The mind's way of coping with extreme stress was to create narratives that made sense of senseless violence. My story of intelligent, communicating creatures was a textbook example of this kind of psychological protection mechanism. When I returned to work, I was reassigned to the main visitor center, handling educational programs and administrative duties. No more solo patrols, no more deep forest assignments. Bill said it was for my own good, that I needed time to rebuild my confidence after the bear encounter. But I could see the way my colleagues looked at me now, the careful way they talked around the subject of what had happened in Grid J12. The missing hiker reports stopped after my incident. Either the creatures had moved to a different area, or they'd learned to be more careful about cleaning up after themselves. The deep forest sections of Kanawha State Forest became off-limits for solo patrols, officially due to increased bear activity, but really because nobody wanted to risk having another ranger encounter whatever had killed David Kellerman and the others. I stayed with the Park Service for another 18 months, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. Every time I looked at the forest, I knew what was out there in the deep places where people didn't go. I knew we were sharing those mountains with something ancient and intelligent and utterly hostile to human presence. And I knew that our official denials and rational explanations wouldn't protect the next person who wandered too far off the marked trails. I work in an office now, handling insurance claims for a company in Charleston. It's safe, predictable work where the worst thing that can happen is a difficult customer or a system crash. I live in a subdivision where the biggest wildlife concern is raccoons getting into garbage cans. I haven't been back to the mountains since I turned in my ranger badge, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees in my neighborhood, I hear sounds that make me get up and check all the locks on my doors. Sounds like heavy breathing and footsteps that are too big and too deliberate to be human. And sometimes I wonder if those creatures remember my name, and if they're still out there in the deep forest, waiting for the day when I might be foolish enough to return to their territory. The official records will tell you that David Kellerman and the others were killed by bears. But I know the truth. There are things in those mountains that are older and smarter and more dangerous than any natural predator. Things that have learned to use our own procedures and protocols against us. Things that see park rangers and forest workers not as protectors of nature, but as threats to be eliminated. If you're ever hiking in the deep woods and you find tracks that don't look quite right, or you hear breathing that's too deep and too regular to be natural, don't try to investigate. Don't try to be a hero or satisfy your curiosity. Just turn around, get back to your car, and drive away as fast as you can. Because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some territories belong to things that were there long before we ever set foot in the forest. And they intend to keep it that way. I was 34 when I found the cabin that shouldn't have existed. My name's Marcus Chen, and I work as a freelance surveyor for the National Forest Service, mapping remote sections of the Appalachian wilderness for logging assessments and trail development. It's solitary work that suits me fine. Just me, my GPS equipment, and thousands of acres of untouched forest. I'd been doing this for 8 years, ever since my divorce, and I thought I knew every ridge, every hollow, every abandoned homestead in the Daniel Boone National Forest. But in October of last year, I discovered something that made me question everything I understood about these mountains. I'd been hired to survey a 2,000-acre section near the Kentucky-Virginia border, an area so remote it didn't even have logging roads. The topographical maps from the 1,970 seconds showed nothing but dense forest and steep terrain, which is why it had never been developed. I was 3 days into a week-long survey, working my way methodically through the grid pattern, when my GPS started acting up. At first, it was just minor glitches, coordinates shifting by a few degrees, satellite signals dropping out for seconds at a time. Standard stuff when you're working under heavy tree cover. But by the third day, the malfunctions were getting worse. My GPS would show me standing in locations I'd never been, or display elevation readings that were impossible given the terrain I could see with my own eyes. That's when I decided to rely on old-school navigation, compass and paper maps. I was working my way along a ridgeline about 12 miles from the nearest dirt road when I saw smoke rising through the trees below me. Thin, gray smoke like someone had banked a fire for the night. I checked my maps 3 times, but there shouldn't have been any structures in this area. No cabins, no hunting camps, nothing but wilderness. But there it was, a curl of smoke drifting up through the yellow and orange canopy like a signal from another world. I should have marked the location and continued with my survey. Should have reported the possible squatters to the Forest Service and let them handle it. But something about that smoke bothered me. It was too controlled, too purposeful. Like whoever had lit that fire knew exactly what they were doing. The descent took me 40 minutes of careful picking through loose shale and deadfall. The forest grew denser as I moved down the slope, old-growth oak and maple so thick they blocked out most of the afternoon sunlight. The air smelled different down there, older, mustier, like a basement that hadn't been opened in decades. But underneath that smell was something else. Wood smoke, yes, but also something organic and wrong. Like meat left too long in the sun. I found the cabin in a small clearing that opened up so suddenly it felt like walking through a door. One moment I was pushing through dense underbrush, and the next I was standing at the edge of a perfectly circular clearing maybe 50 yards across. In the center sat the most perfectly preserved log cabin I'd ever seen. It was old. The chinking between the logs had that gray, weathered look that only comes with decades of mountain winters. But the roof was intact, the windows still held glass, and smoke was definitely rising from the stone chimney. Someone was living here, in the middle of nowhere, at least 12 miles from the nearest road. I called out a greeting, identifying myself as a Forest Service surveyor. My voice echoed strangely in the clearing, like the sound was being absorbed by the trees before it could travel very far. No answer came from the cabin, but I could see a faint glow in the windows that suggested lamplight or firelight inside. The logical thing would have been to approach the front door and introduce myself properly, but something felt wrong about the whole setup. The clearing was too perfect, too circular. The cabin sat exactly in the center, like it had been placed there deliberately, and there were no paths leading to or from the structure. No tire tracks, no foot trails, no indication of how anyone could have gotten supplies in or out of this location. I decided to observe from the tree line before announcing my presence more forcefully. I found a good vantage point behind a massive oak and settled in to watch. For almost an hour, nothing happened. The smoke continued rising steadily from the chimney. The warm light continued glowing in the windows. But I saw no movement, heard no sounds of human activity. That's when I started noticing the details that made my skin crawl. There were no power lines running to the cabin, which made sense given the remote location. But there were also no solar panels, no generator, no propane tanks, no wood pile. Nothing to indicate how the occupants were powering lights or heating the structure. The smoke from the chimney had no scent. I was downwind, and wood smoke should have been noticeable. But I smelled nothing but that underlying organic smell that seemed to be coming from the ground itself. As the sun started setting, the light in the windows grew brighter, but it wasn't the warm, flickering light of oil lamps or candles. It was steady and white, like electric lighting. But there was no way this cabin could have electricity. I was debating whether to approach when I heard the singing. It started so quietly I thought it might be wind through the trees. But gradually I realized it was human voices, multiple people singing in harmony. The melody was nothing I recognized, old, haunting, with intervals that sounded wrong to my modern ears. The words were unclear, but the rhythm was hypnotic, almost like a chant. The singing went on for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps, not on wooden floors inside the cabin, but on the ground outside. Multiple sets of footsteps circling the cabin in a slow, deliberate pattern. But I couldn't see anyone walking around the building. The footsteps were clear as day. The crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, the soft thud of boots on earth. They circled the cabin 3 times in perfect rhythm, like a ritual procession. But the clearing remained empty except for the cabin itself. That's when I noticed that the smoke from the chimney had changed. Instead of rising straight up, it was spiraling in tight corkscrews, defying the steady evening breeze. And the light in the windows was starting to pulse, like a slow heartbeat. I had my camera with me for documentation purposes, so I started taking pictures. Through the telephoto lens, I could see more details that weren't visible to the naked eye. The windows weren't just glowing from inside, there were shapes moving behind the glass. Human-shaped silhouettes that seemed to be dancing or performing some kind of ceremony. But here's the thing that made me start backing away through the trees. The silhouettes were perfectly black against the white light, with no features, no details. Just human shapes cut out of darkness itself. I must have shifted position or made a noise, because suddenly all movement in the cabin stopped. The light in the windows dimmed to almost nothing. The spiraling smoke straightened out and began rising normally. Even the organic smell in the air seemed to fade. Then I heard my name. Marcus, clear as day, spoken in a woman's voice that seemed to come from directly behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there except trees and gathering darkness. Marcus Chen. This time it was a man's voice, coming from somewhere to my left, then another voice from my right, then from above, then from below. A chorus of voices speaking my name, my full name, names I'd never told anyone in these mountains. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush like a wounded animal, using my flashlight to find handholds and footing on the steep slope back up to the ridge. Behind me, I could hear laughter echoing through the forest. Not cruel laughter, but the warm, friendly laughter of people enjoying themselves at a social gathering. It followed me all the way up the mountain, fading only when I reached the ridgeline and could see my campsite in the distance. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by my fire with my back to a large boulder, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. Every sound made me jump, every owl hoot, every branch creaking in the wind, every rustle in the underbrush. The laughter had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the darkness beyond my firelight. When dawn finally came, I broke camp and headed back toward my truck. But I couldn't resist taking one more look at the cabin location from the ridgeline. I had clear sightlines down into the valley, and I knew exactly where the clearing should be. There was nothing there. No clearing, no cabin, no break in the forest canopy, just unbroken wilderness, stretching to the next ridgeline. I checked my GPS coordinates against the photos I'd taken the night before. According to the GPS, I was looking at the exact location where the cabin had been. But there was nothing there except 100-year-old trees that couldn't possibly have grown overnight. When I got back to town, I did some research at the County Historical Society. I told them I was looking into old homesteads for my Forest Service report, which was technically true. The elderly woman who ran the archives was helpful, but when I described the location, she got a strange look on her face. "You didn't find a cabin up there, did you?" she asked. I told her I had, described what I'd seen. Her face went pale. "That would be the Hensley place," she said quietly. Built in 1887 by Thomas Hensley and his family, they were different. Kept to themselves, practiced the old ways. Other families in the area said they weren't quite right. She pulled out a file of old newspaper clippings and photographs. The whole family disappeared in November of 1943. 12 people, including 6 children. Search parties found no trace of them, but the cabin was left completely undisturbed. Food still on the table? Fire still burning in the fireplace. The photograph showed a log cabin that was identical to what I'd seen, down to the stone chimney and window placement. But according to the records, the cabin had been destroyed by the Forest Service in 1955 as a public safety measure. Some people say, the woman continued, lowering her voice, that the Hensleys didn't really leave. They say on certain nights, you can still see lights in the windows and smoke from the chimney. But anyone who goes looking for them. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. I finished my survey work in a different section of forest and filed my report with no mention of the cabin. Officially, there was nothing noteworthy about that particular grid section, just wilderness. But I kept thinking about those voices calling my name. How had they known who I was? I'd never been in that area before, never met anyone who lived in those mountains. Yet something in that clearing had known me well enough to speak my full name. 3 weeks later, I got a call from the Forest Service asking me to return to the same area. A hiking group had reported seeing smoke and lights in a remote section of the forest, and they wanted me to investigate as part of a follow-up survey. I told them I was booked solid for the next 6 months. The truth is, I could go back. I know exactly where the clearing is, know how to find it again. But I also know that whatever lives in that cabin exists outside the normal rules of time and space. The Hensley family didn't disappear in 1943. They found a way to step sideways from the world, to exist in a place that's only sometimes there. And they're still welcoming visitors, still calling people by name, still hosting their eternal social gathering in a cabin that was destroyed 70 years ago. I've changed my specialization to urban surveying now. Parking lots and strip malls don't call your name from impossible places. They don't invite you to join gatherings that have been going on for 80 years. They don't make you question whether you really understand the difference between what's real and what's just temporarily invisible. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that singing, that old, haunting melody with intervals that sound wrong to modern ears. And I know that somewhere in the Daniel Boone National Forest, there's a clearing that appears when it wants to be found, and a cabin full of people who are always happy to have company. They're probably still calling my name. I'm 29 and work as a wilderness photographer for the National Forest Service. Been documenting Appalachian wildlife and landscapes for about 6 years now, which means I spend most of my time alone in places most people never see. I've always preferred it that way, just me, my camera gear, and miles of untouched mountain country. My job takes me deep into the hollows of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, photographing everything from rare wildflowers to erosion patterns for environmental studies. 3 months ago, I got an assignment that changed everything I thought I knew about these mountains. The Forest Service had received reports of an abandoned cabin in a remote hollow near Grayson County that hikers kept stumbling across. Problem was, the cabin wasn't on any of our maps, and the GPS coordinates people gave us kept pointing to different locations. My supervisor wanted me to hike in, document the structure, and figure out if it posed any safety hazards to visitors. I'd been living out of a small apartment in Beckley, West Virginia, for the past 2 years. Most of my neighbors were other federal employees or coal miners, people who understood the mountains but stuck to the main roads and established trails. I was one of the few who regularly went off-grid for days at a time, camping wherever the work took me. My ex-girlfriend used to say I was running away from real life, hiding behind my camera. Maybe she was right, but after growing up in crowded suburbs outside Columbus, the solitude felt like coming home. The reports about this cabin had been trickling in for months. Hikers described finding a well-maintained log structure in a clearing that shouldn't exist, sometimes with smoke coming from the chimney. But when park rangers tried to investigate, they couldn't locate it. The coordinates were always slightly different, and the hikers who reported it could never find it again when they tried to return with officials. My supervisor, Janet, handed me the file on a Friday afternoon. "Probably just people getting turned around in the woods," she said. "But we need to document whatever they're actually seeing. You know these mountains better than anyone." I studied the reports that weekend. 7 different sightings over 4 months, all in roughly the same area, but with coordinates that varied by several miles. The descriptions were surprisingly consistent, though. Single-story log cabin with a stone chimney, small front porch, surrounded by a clearing that felt too perfect for natural formation. 3 of the hikers mentioned feeling like they were being watched from the windows, even though they never saw anyone inside. Monday morning, I loaded my truck with camping gear and photography equipment. The plan was simple: hike into the general area where the sightings clustered, set up camp for a few days, and systematically photograph anything that matched the descriptions. I'd done dozens of similar assignments, documenting illegal campsites, abandoned structures from logging operations, even a few old moonshine stills. The trailhead was about 2 hours from my apartment, at the end of a Forest Service road that most people never bothered to explore. I'd been in this area before, photographing a rare species of salamander the previous spring. The terrain was challenging, steep ridges covered in old-growth forest, with narrow hollows that barely got sunlight even in summer. Perfect place for someone to get disoriented and think they'd found something that wasn't really there. I hiked in about 3 miles before making camp near a small creek. The first day, I covered the southern portion of the search area, following game trails and old logging roads that had been reclaimed by the forest. Nothing unusual, just the typical mix of hardwoods and hemlocks you'd expect in an undisturbed hollow. I photographed everything systematically, marking locations on my GPS, building a visual record of the actual terrain. Day 2 was when things started feeling wrong. I was working my way along a ridgeline when I caught a whiff of wood smoke. Not unusual in itself. Plenty of people burn brush piles or have campfires in the national forest. But this smoke had a different quality to it, older somehow, like it had been burning for a long time. I followed the scent downhill into a narrow hollow I hadn't explored yet. The trees here were different. Instead of the mixed forest I'd been hiking through, this hollow was dominated by massive old chestnuts. Trees that should have died from blight decades ago but somehow survived. The understory was unusually clear, like someone had been maintaining the area, and the silence was absolute. No bird calls, no insect noise, no rustling of small animals in the leaves. I found the cabin just after noon. It sat in a perfectly circular clearing about 50 yards across, exactly like the hikers had described. Single-story log construction, stone chimney with thin gray smoke rising into the still air, small covered porch with 2 wooden chairs. The logs looked hand-hewn but well-maintained, chinked with fresh mortar. A neat stack of split firewood sat beside the front door. I stopped at the edge of the clearing and raised my camera, but my hands were shaking too badly to get a clear shot. Something about the place made my skin crawl. The proportions were wrong somehow. The windows too large, the door too wide, like it had been built for people who weren't quite the right size. I forced myself to approach slowly, documenting everything. The porch boards didn't creak under my weight. The windows were clean, but reflected nothing, just showing black interior. When I got close enough to peer inside, I could see a sparse but tidy room, wooden table, stone fireplace with a small fire burning, shelves lined with mason jars filled with things I couldn't identify. That's when I heard the voice. "You're early." I spun around, heart hammering. A man stood in the doorway, tall, maybe 45, wearing clean work clothes and a patient smile. He looked completely normal except for his eyes, which were the pale gray color of old ice. "Early for what?" I managed to ask. "The arrangement. Though I suppose they didn't tell you about that part." He stepped onto the porch, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to be very quiet. "You're the photographer, right? From the Forest Service?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. My camera felt heavy around my neck. "Good. I've been expecting someone like you. Name's Danny Morrison. I've been the caretaker here for, about 16 years now." The name hit me like a physical blow. Danny Morrison. I'd seen that name in the reports, but not as a witness. As someone who'd gone missing in 2008, presumed dead after his truck was found abandoned near a trailhead in this same area. "You're supposed to be dead," I whispered. Danny's laugh was warm and completely terrifying. "Dead? No, just relocated. Had cancer, you see. Terminal, the doctors said. 6 months at most. Then I found this place, or it found me, and we made an arrangement." He gestured toward the cabin. "I take care of things here. Maintain the property, keep the resident happy. In exchange, I get to stay healthy, stay useful. Fair trade." "What resident?" Danny's smile widened. "Come inside. She's been wanting to meet you." Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Danny held the door open, waiting with infinite patience. The darkness beyond the threshold seemed to shift and writhe like something alive. "I know you're scared," he said gently. I was too, at first. But fear's just unfamiliarity. Once you understand the arrangement, it all makes perfect sense. I found myself walking toward the porch, each step feeling like I was walking underwater. The closer I got to the doorway, the more the air seemed to thicken around me. My camera equipment felt impossibly heavy. "What kind of arrangement?" I asked. "The kind that keeps everyone safe?" Danny replied, "These mountains have always had residents. Things that lived here long before people arrived. Most of them are harmless if you know how to coexist. But some need more active management." I reached the threshold and looked into the cabin. The interior was larger than it should have been, stretching back into shadows that my eyes couldn't penetrate. The fire in the stone fireplace burned without crackling, its flames too blue and too still. "She feeds on loneliness," Danny explained, his voice now coming from behind and beside and inside my head all at once. "Always has. Used to take hikers, campers, anyone who wandered into her territory feeling lost or isolated. Dozens of people every year, consumed completely. Body, mind, soul. In the darkness at the back of the cabin, something moved. Not human, but not animal either. Something that existed in the spaces between definition, in the hollow places where light couldn't reach. But then we figured out the arrangement," Danny continued. "One person stays with her, keeps her company, feeds her just enough loneliness to keep her satisfied. In exchange, she leaves everyone else alone, and she gives her caretaker what they need most." The thing in the shadows was approaching now, and I could feel its hunger like a physical pressure in my chest. It fed on isolation, on the desperate ache of people who spent too much time alone. People like me. "What did you need most?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Purpose," Danny said. "Meaning, a reason to keep living when the cancer was eating me alive. She gave me all of that and took away the disease." Fair trade. The entity reached the edge of the firelight, and I finally saw her clearly. She was beautiful in the way that abandoned places are beautiful, full of loss and memory and terrible truth. Her form shifted between woman and shadow and something older than both, but her need was constant and absolute. "What does she want from me?" I asked. Danny's hand settled on my shoulder, gentle but firm. "Same thing she wanted from me, same thing she wants from everyone. Connection, understanding. Someone who won't run away when they see what she really is." I thought about my life outside these mountains, the empty apartment, the job that kept me isolated for weeks at a time, the ex-girlfriend who was probably right about me running away from real relationships. I thought about all the nights I'd spent alone in the wilderness, telling myself I preferred it that way. "The Forest Service will look for me," I said weakly. "No, they won't. Your supervisor will receive photos and a report explaining that you found nothing unusual in this area. The cabin will disappear from hikers' stories. Everything will go back to normal." Danny's voice was infinitely patient. "Except you won't be alone anymore. Neither will she." The entity reached toward me with appendages that might have been arms or might have been streams of living shadow. Her touch was cold but not unpleasant, like stepping into a cool cave on a hot day. I could feel her hunger, but also her loneliness. Centuries of isolation broken only by brief encounters with terrified humans who fled at the first sight of her true nature. "The arrangement isn't forever," Danny said. 15, maybe 20 years. Then someone else will come, someone who needs what this place can offer, and you'll help them understand, the way I'm helping you. I realized my camera was documenting everything automatically. Muscle memory, making me capture this impossible moment. But the photos would show only an empty cabin, an ordinary clearing. Nothing that would bring investigators or curiosity seekers. "What if I say no?" I asked. Danny's smile was sad but understanding. "Then you walk away. Go back to your empty apartment, your solitary assignments, your carefully maintained distance from everyone who might care about you. Keep taking pictures of places instead of living in them." The entity's touch reached my face, and I felt her loneliness merge with mine. For the first time in years, maybe in my entire adult life, I wasn't alone. The feeling was overwhelming, terrifying, and absolutely necessary. "Or," Danny continued, "you stay. Make the arrangement. Learn what it means to be truly needed by someone who will never judge you, never leave you, never ask you to be anything other than what you are." I looked around the cabin one more time. At the tidy shelves, the warm fire, the sense of purpose and belonging that radiated from every corner. Then I looked at Danny, healthy and content after 16 years of service. "Okay," I said. That was 3 months ago. Danny stayed for 2 weeks, teaching me the routines of care and feeding that keep our residents satisfied. How to tend the fire that burns without consuming wood. How to listen to her stories about the mountains when they were young. How to let her feed on my loneliness without being diminished by it. The Forest Service received my final report and a complete photographic survey of the area, showing no unusual structures. My supervisor was satisfied. My apartment lease expired, and my possessions went to charity. As far as the official world knows, I completed my assignment and moved on to a new posting in Colorado. The truth is simpler and more complex. I found what I didn't know I was looking for. A place where being alone doesn't mean being lonely, where my need for solitude serves a purpose greater than just hiding from human connection. She feeds on isolation, but she also transforms it into something useful, something protective. The hikers still come sometimes. Most of them just feel unsettled and leave quickly. But occasionally someone arrives who recognizes what this place really is. Not abandoned at all, but carefully maintained by arrangements that keep the mountains safe and the lonely souls fed. When my time here ends, probably in another 12 or 15 years, someone else will make the same choice I did. Someone who needs what only this place can offer. And I'll help them understand the arrangement the way Danny helped me. Until then, I tend the fire that never goes out, document the beauty that most people will never see, and keep company with something older and more patient than human loneliness. It's the best job I've ever had. I was 22 when I took that insurance job documenting abandoned properties in eastern Kentucky. Fresh out of college with a photography degree and about $50 in my bank account. So when Heritage Insurance offered me $200 a day plus expenses to drive around taking pictures of cabins and farmhouses they'd inherited through unpaid policies, it seemed like easy money. Just document the property condition, take some photos for their files, and move on to the next one. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. I had a list of 12 properties scattered across 3 counties, all abandoned for at least 5 years, some much longer. Most were just run-down trailers or falling-apart houses that weren't worth much anyway. But the cabin up on Kettle Mountain was different from the start. My GPS lost signal about 5 miles before I reached it, and I had to follow hand-drawn directions the insurance company had provided. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by old-growth forest, probably built in the 1940 seconds from local timber. 2 stories, wraparound porch, stone chimney still intact. It was in surprisingly good condition for something that had been sitting empty for over a decade. The key was hidden under a flower pot on the porch, exactly where the paperwork said it would be. Inside, the cabin was like stepping back in time. All the furniture was still there, kitchen table set for 4, living room arranged around a stone fireplace, even books on the shelves. But what caught my attention immediately were the family photographs covering every surface. There had to be 50 framed photos throughout the main room. Wedding pictures, family reunions, children's school portraits, holiday gatherings, all featuring the same extended family across what looked like several decades. The photos were professionally done, the kind of formal portraits families use to commission for special occasions. I started with my standard documentation routine, photographing each room from multiple angles, noting any damage or valuable items. The cabin was remarkably well preserved. No water damage, minimal dust, like the family had just stepped out for the day and never came back. It wasn't until I developed the first roll of film back at my motel that I noticed something odd. In several of my photos, the family portraits on the mantel appeared to be positioned differently than I remembered. Not dramatically different, just slightly off. Like someone had adjusted them between shots. I figured I was just remembering wrong. After documenting a dozen abandoned properties in 3 days, they all started to blur together. Plus, I'd been shooting with available light through dusty windows, which could create optical illusions. But when I went back the next morning to take additional exterior shots, I decided to check the portraits more carefully. I stood in front of the mantel and compared the arrangement to my photos from the previous day. The positions were definitely different. 3 pictures that had been angled slightly toward the center of the room were now facing directly forward. More unsettling was the realization that, in the photos I'd taken, the family members seemed to be looking directly at my camera, not at where the original photographer would have stood. At my position, 20 feet away in the center of the room, I convinced myself it was a trick of perspective. Old portrait photography often created the illusion of direct eye contact from multiple viewing angles. But as I took more photos that morning, I started paying closer attention to the details. The main family portrait above the fireplace showed a couple in their 40s with 3 children, probably taken in the 1,960 seconds based on their clothing and hairstyles. In my viewfinder, they appeared to be looking slightly over my left shoulder, but in the developed photo, they were looking directly into the lens. By the time I finished the second roll of film, I was thoroughly creeped out. Every portrait in every photo showed the subjects making direct eye contact with my camera, despite appearing to look elsewhere when I was actually there. That evening, in my motel room, I laid out all the photos chronologically and realized something even more disturbing. The family members weren't just looking at my camera, they were getting closer to the edges of their frames with each successive photo. In my first shots, they were positioned normally within their portraits. By the middle of the second roll, they appeared to have shifted slightly forward in their frames. In the most recent photos, several family members seemed to be reaching toward the front edge of their portraits, hands pressed against the glass as if trying to push through. I stared at those photos for hours, trying to find a rational explanation. Camera malfunction, developing error, overactive imagination, brought on by stress and isolation. But the images were clear and consistent. Something in that cabin was responding to my presence, and it was getting stronger. The next morning, I almost drove home without going back. But I needed this job, and walking away without completing the assignment would mean not getting paid for any of the work I'd already done. Besides, it was just an old cabin with some weird photo effects. Probably had something to do with the lighting or mirror reflections I hadn't noticed. When I unlocked the cabin door for the 3rd time, I immediately knew something had changed. The family portraits were arranged differently again, but more dramatically this time. Several had been moved to new locations entirely. The main portrait above the fireplace had been replaced by a smaller one that had previously sat on a side table. And in the center of the mantel, where a child's school photo had been the day before, there was now a Polaroid picture of me taking photos in the cabin. I recognized my camera, my jacket, even the angle I'd been standing at, but I hadn't taken any Polaroid photos, and I didn't see a Polaroid camera anywhere in the cabin. The photo showed me from behind, focused on photographing the far wall. But reflected in the window glass behind me, I could see figures standing in the room. The same family from all the portraits, watching me work. That's when I heard the sound from upstairs. Not footsteps exactly, more like the creaking of old floorboards under careful weight. Slow, deliberate movement from someone trying not to be heard. I called out, thinking maybe a caretaker or relative had come to check on the property. No response, but the movement stopped immediately. The silence that followed was worse than the creaking had been. I decided to investigate, partly because I needed to document the second floor anyway, and partly because the alternative was leaving without understanding what was happening. My camera felt heavier than usual as I climbed the narrow wooden stairs. The upstairs hallway ran the length of the cabin, with 3 bedrooms and a bathroom opening off it. Each room was furnished and decorated like the family was still living there. Children's toys in the smaller bedrooms, reading glasses on a nightstand, clothes hanging in closets. But it was the photographs that made me understand the true scope of what I was dealing with. Every bedroom contained dozens more family portraits, arranged in careful displays on dressers and walls. And in every single photograph, the subjects were facing the doorway where I stood. Not just looking in my general direction, their eyes tracked my movement as I walked through the rooms. When I moved to the left side of a doorway, their gazes shifted left. When I stepped to the right, they followed. And they were definitely closer to the front of their frames than they had been downstairs. Some appeared to be pressing against the glass, hands and faces distorted by the pressure. A few looked like they were starting to push through the surface of their photographs entirely. In the master bedroom, I found what I was looking for and what I'd been dreading. On the dresser, arranged in a neat row, were 5 more Polaroid photos of me in the cabin. The photos showed my entire visit chronologically, entering the cabin on day 1, taking photos downstairs, examining the mantel, climbing the stairs, and finally standing in this exact bedroom, looking at the dresser. The last photo in the sequence showed me from a perspective that would have required someone to be standing directly behind me. In it, I was reaching for the Polaroid photos, while family members from the portraits stood around me in a loose circle. Their bodies partially emerged from their frames like they were climbing out of windows. I spun around, expecting to see them there, but the bedroom was empty except for the furniture and photographs. When I looked back at the dresser, there was now a 6th Polaroid, a photo of me turning around, with the family members reaching toward me from all directions. That's when I ran. Not walked quickly, not calmly exited. I ran down those stairs and out of that cabin like my life depended on it. As I reached the front door, I could hear sounds from every room in the house. Picture frames falling, glass breaking, furniture being moved around. I got in my car and drove straight back to Louisville without stopping, not even to get my things from the motel. The next day I called Heritage Insurance and told them I'd completed the documentation but couldn't submit the photos due to equipment malfunction. They were annoyed but paid me for the other 11 properties. I never developed that last roll of film from the cabin. Part of me was afraid of what I'd see, and part of me didn't want to give whatever was in there any more opportunities to interact with me. I switched to digital photography after that and found work with a real estate company that only deals with occupied properties. But sometimes, when I'm going through old photo files on my computer, I find pictures I don't remember taking. Usually they're just random shots that got mixed in somehow, probably from other photographers or previous memory card users. Except last month, I found a digital photo buried in my archives that showed the interior of that cabin on Kettle Mountain. The photo was taken from the perspective of someone standing in the center of the main room, looking directly at the mantel. Every picture frame was empty except one, the main family portrait above the fireplace. But instead of the 1,960 seconds family that had been there before, the portrait now showed me, standing in that same room, holding my camera and looking directly out at whoever was viewing the photograph. And in the bottom corner of the digital file, there was metadata showing it was taken last week, with GPS coordinates placing it at that exact cabin in eastern Kentucky. I still have that photo saved on my computer. Sometimes I open it late at night and stare at my own image trapped in that frame, wondering if somewhere in a cabin on Kettle Mountain, there's a family looking back at me and planning their next move. I don't take insurance photos anymore. Some properties are abandoned for good reasons, and some families never really leave. They just find new ways to stay connected to the places they called home. If you ever get offered easy money to photograph abandoned places in rural Kentucky, my advice is to find a different line of work. Some pictures are better left untaken, and some frames are meant to stay empty.